Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another design team project for Trinity Stamps. And today we're going to be doing some very loose, easy watercoloring with some distress inks using the Let Love Grow and Hello Sweet Friend stamp sets. Just a couple of the single images within these stamp sets. So I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper here, and this is cut down to, I think, a little smaller than an A2 size card, but honestly, it doesn't work. It doesn't really matter because we're going to die cut this in the end. But we're just going to create a background with some of these floral and succulent stamps within both of the stamp sets. So I'm using a total of 4 different images here, and I'm just lining those up onto my card panel, and it doesn't really matter how you line them up, but I'm using antique linen. This is regular distress ink, and I'm going to be stamping this twice. Now I can see it pretty good just stamping once, but to make it a little easier for you guys to see it and myself, once I start the watercoloring, I do stamp it twice. The watercolor paper is a textured paper, so you don't always get a good impression the first time anyway. So once I stamp them the first time, I'm just going to rearrange those in order to fill up the entire card panel, just working my way from left to right. Doesn't really matter which direction you move, but you'll see that I have a little leaf stamp there too, and I'm pretty much using that for the smaller areas. So if there's any larger gaps between my main images, I'll just use that small little stamp to kind of fill in any blank space. So as you can see, I sped this up a little bit because I'm pretty much just doing the same thing, just moving the stamps and stamping them twice. And you'll see that I have a little bit of an empty area here towards the end. I'm not really worried about stamping too much off the page because, like I said, I'm going to die cut this panel down. So it doesn't really matter if you stamp off the page like you typically do when creating a background. So just taking that little leaf and filling in that small little gap, and then we'll move in onto the watercoloring. So I'm using some distress inks. Like I said, I'm using fossilized amber, abandoned coral, cracked pistachio, salty ocean, mermaid lagoon, and later you'll see that I'll bring in the blueprint sketch. So I'm going to start off with these little leaves here, and I'm going in with a damp brush and picking up some of the pigment and just basically filling in those little leaves. And I'm not worried about the stem at this point. I want my leaves to be pretty much dry before I fill in the stem. I'm going to work on a couple different images all at once because you want this to give it just a minute or so to start drying. It doesn't need to be completely dry. You want it to be a little damp so that your colors will still blend, but you don't want a whole pool or a puddle of water on your paper. So once it is damp and it's not puddled, I'm gonna just dip my damp paintbrush into the salty ocean and just pick up a tiny bit of pigment and drop that in on the base of each of the leaves and let that blue kind of spread out with that green so that you have some kind of variation of color. Once that was done and the leaves they don't have to be completely dry, but once they start to dry a little bit where they're not just going to spread all over the place, I'm going to pick up some more of that cracked pistachio with just the very tip of my paintbrush, and I'm using a number 2 round brush, and I'm just going to go right over the stems that are part of the stamped image. So if you mess up, that's fine. Just make them a little bit thicker because this is kind of like a no-line look. It's actually more forgiving. I know it's a little scarier than having that bold black image, or a bold black outline, I should say, but it's actually more forgiving if you make a mistake. Just either change the shape or make your image a little bit bigger. So going to move on to the rest of the images here, and I'm just going to show you a little bit of each one to kind of show you how I do this. So for this one, I'm going to be using the fossilized amber, and I'm pretty much doing the same thing as far as filling in those petals, leaving them pretty damp but not puddling, and then I'll pick up just a little bit of that abandoned coral and drop that in the darkest areas of each of those petals. So it's going to be primarily where the one petal is kind of hanging underneath another, or on the base of the petals typically. Now your colors are going to spread, and each petal is going to look a little bit different depending on how much of that abandoned coral you add. And I know it's very hard to determine how much you're adding sometimes, but quite honestly, I wanted this to be kind of, I don't want to say messy, but very loose. These are not going to look realistic at all. And I'm okay with that. That's the look I'm kind of going for. And it's fun just to kind of sit down and watercolor without having to worry about it looking perfect. So I went ahead and added the abandoned coral, and you'll see here that I'm working on petals that are not touching one another. So I'm kind of working on maybe 2 or 3 petals from each flower at a time and letting those completely dry. You don't even want these to be damp before you work on a petal that's directly next to it, because your colors will blend in places that you don't want them to blend. You'll also see that once these petals start drying, they automatically start to form kind of like a barrier between the next petal over it, next to it. So you don't necessarily have to worry about too much shading, because the way these dry back, they kind of create that already for you. And like I said, I'm going for a loose look anyway, so I don't need to create a whole lot of dimension. We're pretty much only using 2 colors just to get a variation of color, not necessarily dimension. So I went ahead and colored all of this particular image throughout the entire panel, the same way with the fossilized amber and the abandoned coral. And next we're going to move on to the salty ocean. So we're going to move on to this next flower, and I'm pretty much doing this the same way as I did with the yellows, 1 petal at a time, or a couple petals at a time, just as long as they're not directly next to one another. Going in and adding that salty ocean, and then I'm going to go in a little bit with the mermaid lagoon, sorry, to get a little bit of variation of color. Now you can go directly in with this mermaid or the salty ocean, whatever your lightest color is, your first color. You can go in right with a damp paintbrush with that pigment on it. Or you can go in with a damp paintbrush and get that particular petal wet like I'm doing now with just clean water, and then just drop in your color and let that spread. Your color or your pigment or ink or whatever you're using is only going to spread as far as you put the water. So it's not on watercolor paper, your pigment is not going to spread in dry areas. So as long as you cover that petal, that's as far as it's going to spread. Again, if you happen to make a mistake or go out of the lines a little bit, it's okay. Just change the shape or make that petal just a little bit bigger than maybe the actual image is. Nobody's ever going to know the difference, because they're not going to see the outline of that particular image. Now, if you don't go directly over the line that we stamped with antique linen, you may see that line show through a little bit. And quite honestly, it's such a light color that I'm okay with that too. So sometimes you may see a little bit of the outline showing, and I'm okay. So once the salty ocean, or the combination of salty ocean and mermaid lagoon, was done, and I'm not going to show you all of these again, I'm going to move on to the other, or the final flower here, and this is where I'm going to eventually bring in the blueprint sketch. So my base color, or my first color, is going to be the mermaid lagoon, and I'm doing this the same way, going in with a damp paintbrush with that pigment, covering up that entire petal, working on a few petals at a time, as long as they're not touching. And while it's still damp but not puddled, this is where I'm going to add a little bit of the blueprint sketch, because I needed a little bit of variation of color. Now the blueprint sketch is I guess a darker but brighter blue, and it has a little bit of a purplish tint to it, I guess. And I really liked the way these 2 colors combined together when watercoloring. So these are larger flowers. Well, they're not really larger flowers. They just have a whole lot more petals. But honestly, these were the easiest to do, because it's so forgiving that if I got towards that center and I kind of lost track with what petal is what, I kind of just made it up as I went along, because nobody's going to know the difference. My rule is, if you can't tell what it is or what it's supposed to be, the recipient of the card isn't going to be able to tell either. They're not going to look at each and every petal and notice every mistake that you made. And watercolor, it's full of mistakes, and it's fine. That's what makes it unique. So I'm going to go through this entire panel, and it really honestly didn't take me that long, maybe about an hour or so. And once all of my colors are completely dry, you'll want to make sure that all of your flowers and leaves are completely dry before you move on to the next step. I had a lot of white space. So in order to fix this and kind of keep up with this messy watercolor look that I'm going for, I'm going to smush a little bit more of that fossilized amber, the cracked pistachio, and eventually the salty ocean. Add quite a bit of water to that and just dip my paintbrush in there and splatter that everywhere, all over the card panel with all three of those colors. I was initially going to keep it pretty light, but with the salty ocean, I felt like that brought out the blue a little bit more. Once that panel was dry, I'm going to use a large stitched rectangle die to go ahead and cut that down. And now for the sentiment, I was initially going to actually watercolor my sentiment, but I decided I didn't like that. It wasn't bold and bright enough. So I'm just going to go ahead and stamp that thank you with the salty ocean, I believe. Actually, I think I might have used the Mermaid Lagoon. They're very similar to one another. And I'm going to use the smaller stitched rectangle die and run that through my Gemini as well. Now I kind of laid this down onto my card base to kind of see how this was looking along with the sentiment, and it needed a little bit something. Nothing was really popping out. So I went through my scrap bin actually, and I don't know what color cardstock this is or even what brand cardstock this is, to be honest with you, but I kind of matched it next to the distress ink that I used for the sentiment, and it matched pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this down slightly larger than my main panel and another piece that is slightly larger than my sentiment panel. I'll go ahead and use my ATG gun to adhere my main panel just because this is a little bit warped from the water that we put on it, and I find that the ATG gun works best. Adhere that to my blue panel, then use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere that blue panel flat down to my card base, and then take my sentiment there and use some Scotch foam tape to pop this up. And I kind of debated on where to put this. I was going to center it, but I didn't want to cover up that yellow flower just because I felt like I was losing some of that yellow. So ultimately it is centered, but I decided to put this down just a little bit further. Last, I added just a few embellishments to kind of break up that background a little bit. And that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.